Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Crombie, and I'll be your host for this evening. Let me begin by, first of all, introducing a panel of guests that we've assembled, a distinguished group, as you'll soon see. First of all, let me introduce Duke Redbird. Duke Redbird is an elder, a poet, an artist, an educator, and a filmmaker. And he was honored with a doctorate degree from the Ontario College of Arts and Design, and been awarded an Lifetime Achievement for his work in human rights. And last year, he published a collection of poems entitled simply Poetry. We also have Ron Williams, founder and senior associate of Archaeological Services, Inc. Ron has a master's degree and a PhD in anthropology from McGill University. He's chair of the board of directors of the Museum of Ontario Archaeology at Western University. And he's, as many people will know, he's published extensively on both Indigenous and early Great Lakes colonial history. We also have John Lorinc, Toronto journalist and editor. He writes about urban affairs, business, sustainability, local history, and for various media, including Spacing Magazine and the Globe and Mail. He's also the nonfiction editor for Coach House Books. And finally, Leslie Wu, architect and planner, and a newly crowned CEO of CivicAction. She was the former chief planning and development officer for Metrolinx. And in 2017, Leslie was honored as one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women. And as well, she was chosen outstanding leader for Canada's Women's Infrastructure Network. She's also the creator of SheBuildCities.org, which is a celebration of women city builders around the world. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. A modest thought from me. Tonight's topic, the idea of community, is central to the history of the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse, the home of this speaker's corner. The schoolhouse began in 1848 as an act of philanthropy to serve the needy and neglected children of the Irish community, which had been devastated by the typhoid epidemic coming from Ireland a year earlier, from people fleeing the Irish potato famine. Over time, it served the community in various ways: elementary school, a Sunday school, a wartime recruiting center, a soup kitchen, a meeting hall. And today, as part of Ontario Heritage Trust, it has become a place for family and community celebrations and a heritage education as well. The idea of community is, of course, at the very heart of Toronto's own story from the earliest of times, as a gathering place for people moving from continent to continent, region to region, country to country, country to city, and countryside to city. And as of today, as we look at a post-pandemic world, we'll be looking again for new ways to have the idea of community service again. So let's hear the perspectives from each of our distinguished panel. Beginning first of all with you, Duke, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, thank you so much, David. I want to say Ani and Bojo and Sego and Tansi to all my Indigenous friends in Toronto, and greetings and welcome to everyone else who's viewing tonight. I feel so honored to be invited to be a member of tonight's panel. And especially, I'm pleased to be invited to offer a few remarks of welcome this evening in my capacity as an Anishinaabe elder. So tonight, I want to begin by sharing with everyone a short historical tapestry that was woven by the many peoples who, over generations, have had the privilege of being the keepers and stewards of this part of Ontario. So our tapestry starts with a group of travelers who left their moccasin-clad footprints in the blue clay beneath the buildings in downtown Toronto. Now, this particular journey by Indigenous people took place over 12,000 years ago, and the footprints were uncovered by a dredging crew while doing some underwater work in the foot of Bay Street back in 1908. So as we reach back from those first Torontonians to the present generation, we always like to acknowledge the Wendat Huron, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the present treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit, who over centuries were the weavers who wove the fabric that now cloaks us in such a rich tradition of peace, joy, and harmony. The name Toronto originated from the Haudenosaunee phrase Takaranto, which means where there are trees standing in the water where fish could gather. And through an agreement with the Mississaugas of the Credit in 1805, the protection and management of these lands has now been passed to the present generation of Canadians and citizens of Toronto to continue the tradition of compassionate stewardship so that future generations will continue to enjoy the beauty of these lands, remembering always that we never own the land, but rather we borrow its use from our children and grandchildren and future generations. So this evening, in accordance with our teachings, we gratefully acknowledge and honor all the many diverse cultures and people who over time have made Toronto their home. So in keeping with this time-honored tradition, I would like to share with you a poem in the way of land acknowledgement that I wrote called A Dish with One Spoon. And it goes like this. The Indigenous nations welcomed settlers from across the seas when they arrived in their territories. Such beauty revealed before the settlers' eyes was beyond their ability to describe. In all the languages that the settlers spoke, there were no words that could evoke with any clarity a single thought that Mother Nature's splendor brought. It was from the Indigenous tongues that they learned the language of the earth in all her idioms. Toronto from Takaranto, trees standing in the water, a meeting place where small fish could gather, nearby hills where alders grow. That was called Etobicoke. And in the autumn, before the winter snows, the passenger pigeons rested in Mimico. And to the west, where the great waters flow, the lake and lands were called Ontario. Now eagles soar high with prayers for Manitou. The Mississauga people launched their birch bark canoes. Three sisters, corn, bean, and squash. The planting season has begun. Tobacco is offered a gift to grandfather's son. Sage, sweetgrass, and cedar to grandmother moon. There is peace, joy, and harmony in the treaty lands called A Dish with One Spoon. Megwetch, and thank you, David, for inviting me on this panel.
Excellent, Duke. Thank you very much. Loved it. Ron, could I go to you?
Sure. That was wonderful, Duke. And it links very nicely with a few comments I'd like to make. I think there's nothing simple about how the various communities to which we belong are connected and how they function. It's dynamic, it's exceptionally complex, and hence it's not easy to define. However, one thing that I like to reflect about because of what I do as an archaeologist is how did people and how do people today derive social meaning from our daily experiences with the landscape? Whether one's born in Toronto today, or whether you come from nearby, or whether you immigrated from another country, one way we can all connect is through a cognitive map of the landscape in our minds. The way Duke put it in his poem, which I love, is learning the language of the earth and doing that from Indigenous peoples. And I think we need to develop that shared map in our minds. When settlers arrived here, they used those same paths, the rivers, the ravines, and the carrying places or the portages that linked the North Shore of Lake Ontario with the Upper Great Lakes. And it was through learning from Indigenous peoples that the very first settlers learned to use the landscape. It also informed the very first communities that lived in Toronto. And I'm not speaking about those very small groups of people back when Duke was talking about the footprints from 12,000 years ago, but larger communities. 500 years ago, and I'll just tell the story of this one village. 500 years ago, just south of York University, north of Finch, on the Black Creek Valley and west of Sentinel, was a 7-acre village surrounded by a palisade, housing 50 or 60 longhouses. That village or community was surrounded by hundreds of acres of cornfields, or the fields which had the 3 sisters that Duke spoke of. The corn was required because that village, with its 1,500 to 2,000 people, each person needed about a pound to a pound and a half of corn per day. So that meant that community required 2,000 or more pounds of corn per day. We don't think of that scale when we think about 500 years ago and the necessities of life that a community of that size would need. They also needed 7,000 to 10,000 animal hides or animal skins annually. How did they get them? Well, they got them from the landscape, and they also got them from the fact that they were not insular. We think of Toronto as a global community, as a community of people from many parts of the world. So too was that community. Although centered in this landscape, it had connections, and I know this from the archaeological record, it had connections to the Midwest, to Wisconsin, to the Mississippi Valley, to the Gulf of Mexico, to the Atlantic coast, to the St. Lawrence Valley, and even Northern Ontario. So my point is, where we live today, as we develop this map of our own landscape, and I dare say people discovered more about the landscape during COVID than maybe they knew before, simply by getting out and walking. But it's a part not only of what is today, but of what was and what will always be the bones of this city. And it's a way to link us all in this community.
Wow, Ron, that was beautiful. Thank you very, very much. Okay, now next up, we have John. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, David. And it's great to be on this panel with Duke and Leslie and Ron. So when we had a little pre-event discussion about, what we were going to talk about last week. And, I started thinking about what we mean when we talk about community, which is the theme of this. And I started thinking about the communities that I belong to, some of which are social, some of which are geographical. And so I'll begin with something actually that happened this morning. I was out with the dog early on, and I ran into a guy I went to public school with in North Toronto. So we've known each other for 52 years, which seems ridiculous. And we run into each other once in a while, and we were chatting and just shooting the breeze. And I thought, okay, this is a great way to start the day because, I like this guy, and, it's nice to run into people. And so, well, what are the other communities? So I can kind of enumerate them. I play hockey with one group of guys who lives just west of me, and another group that's in, that plays at Bill Bolton. I have a community of friends from high school and public school. I have a community of neighbors in the area where I live, which is around St. Clair and Christie. I have a community of people who, unfortunately, many of them are passing, but who, were friends of my parents when I was growing up, and I saw a lot of them. And then I have a community of people who I know professionally, in my profession as a journalist, and the people that I, interact with, my sources, some of whom are on this panel tonight. And so there are all these kind of, I feel like I'm incredibly fortunate because I'm situated in the middle of all of these circles that overlap. And so the thing that I wanted to point out about this is that, my parents arrived here as refugees in 1956 and really didn't know anybody at all. They got here by a fluke, like a couple of flukes, the last of which was that their plane, which was headed to Montreal, got snowed out, and it was shunted over to Toronto, so they just stayed. So they went from zero, knowing no one, to establishing themselves. My father got a job as a doctor. My mother worked as a medical technician, and basically began to embed themselves into the city, which, truth be told, was not that friendly at the beginning, and gradually, built communities for themselves, which I, had the great fortune of kind of inheriting in a way. And they also inherited communities that existed before them. And I've written a lot, in my career about immigration to Toronto. And, with the exception of the Indigenous people, the thing that is common to everybody who lives in the city is that they came from somewhere else, or their ancestors came from somewhere else. And so this is an amazing common denominator. And I've always been interested in how is it that a place that's got so many layers of people is able to function. It's not a Tower of Babel, actually, but it could be. It's definitely not perfect. And, we'll talk about that later. But there are ways in which the existing communities kind of absorb, sometimes with friction, sometimes with not, the newcomers. And so just a little story. So my parents got here in 1956, and being Hungarians, they liked espresso, and they couldn't find a decent cup of coffee in Toronto in 1956, except on College Street, where they could get Italian espresso. And why could they get Italian espresso on College Street? Because an earlier generation of Italian immigrants who had settled in the ward, which is around the bus station, had grown up, had children, moved to College Street, started businesses, one of which sold Barzula coffee at that weird little dog leg on College Street, and that's where my parents got their coffee. So at this process kind of multiplies and it goes out, and so we could talk about sprawl, but there's this sort of accumulation of neighborhoods and communities that kind of extend outward and sort of become interlinked. And I have a young colleague now who grew up in Mississauga, and she's doing an amazing job of reporting on the COVID crisis in Peel. Her name is Fatima Saeed, and I met her in a serendipitous way. Now we work together quite frequently, and I think, okay, well, this is great, right? That community extended out to Mississauga and beyond, and so I think that it's an interesting and noteworthy dynamic about the city of Toronto and the Greater Toronto area. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, John, very much. Leslie.
Thank you. And yes, like everyone, I'm delighted to be here. David, thank you for inviting me. I want to kind of attack the thought of what is a community. It's maybe slightly different. And because I came here when I was 18 to go to university. And as I was reflecting on our conversation last week and thinking about how to approach this concept of what is changing about community, or rather, how should community change, I realized there were sort of 3 steps in my sense of belonging to this place called Toronto. And I think the first step is, and because I studied architecture, I had to go back to this concept of civitas and what is a city, what is a community. And, the first step into entering the city was actually something that was defined and described, and roles defined for me by law. So to become a permanent, first to have a student visa, and then to be a permanent resident. And it is fairly prescribed in terms of my joining a city, and that's referred to as you know, the civitas of the place. There's a common set of rules and an understanding that binds us, and there's a clear kind of a notion of what society expects from you through a city. The idea of community, or in the Latin it's communitas, is this notion of shared common experience, and that how somehow through a shared common experience it's an equalizer, because we have no matter where we came from, we have this kind of common experience that binds us, and they can be small. John described, when I say small, like in a geographically small is what John describes in terms of within your neighborhood and within your community. I think right now at this moment there are a number of what I call global shared experiences around a pandemic, the viewing of the death of George Floyd. But at the same time, there are other kind of more sort of bright lights of common experience, like the Raptors winning, or everybody watching FIFA. And those things to me are an idea of community, because we have this common touch point that we are, no matter where you come from. And that for me, when I came to Toronto, there were a number of things like that, that for someone who didn't have too much extended roots in the city, I began to really start to feel like, okay, maybe I'm not an imposter, maybe I belong. I think there's one next generation of this idea of community, which is kind of in the space I am now, and it is part of, you know, my journey as a planner and so forth, which is this notion of collaboration, which, you know, in the Latin, it's co and labor. It's about working together. And it's about working together, oftentimes to create something new or to achieve a common goal. And unlike civitas or communitas, I think collaboration requires a higher degree of leadership. And so I know that in all the work I have done in the past with large communities, small communities, it's that common experience of working together towards a common goal. And there's instances, I know a part of the work I did with David back when we Toronto bid for the 2000 Olympic Games, you know, we have this shared experience that just will not unbind us. We cannot unwind ourselves. We're so tied. I know now working at CivicAction with these incredible, young, talented, rising leaders from across this region, they want to work together, to collaborate for change and impact. And they're creating their own community that doesn't have necessarily a geography. It doesn't have a neighborhood. It is this desire to work together for a greater reward and to put their resources together. And so in my mind, and when I asked some of them, you know, I let some of our folks from the Emerging Leaders Network know I was going to talk about this. I said, what is it about, what is it? There's 3,000 of you and you just can't leave each other. You keep wanting to work on different issues and talk about important things. And I think that is the community of the future. They represent a new way about thinking of ourselves. I think like Duke and Ron say, it has to be grounded. It has a spatial aspect to it. I think COVID and the internet has enabled us to connect in a slightly different way that maybe we had to rely on spatial connection. But I think that as we think about what is changing, even though we may not see it physically, it is happening in our midst as rising leaders from all walks of life, some of who are very new to this country, are taking up the act of collaborating to work together because they want a different future. They want to heal the rifts of the past. They want to see bridges that as we get through this big shared experience of a pandemic, that we quote unquote build back better. So I think I'll leave it there, David, because there's lots to dig in here.
Well, that's really good. Thank you very much, Leslie. I'm not sure if anybody would like to jump in and pick up something, either extending what they themselves were talking about, or somebody's already mentioned that they would like to pick up on. Now is a good time to do that if you'd like. Any one of you? Okay. Okay, go ahead, Duke.
Well, you know, as a poet, I think in metaphors, and I think of the word citizenship it's we're on a ship, and I think of ship of state. That's another a bigger ship. I think well, we started out with birch bark canoes, and then a few people came over, and then there was a rowboat, and then as time went by, the ships got a little bigger, and more people were invited along, and the ship of state and the citizenship of Toronto now, we are on a voyage together through life, and it's a huge ship, and there are a few people who you know are in the steerage section and need to get up on the deck once in a while, and then there are other folks that are you know, port out and starboard home kind of thing. But when I think of it that way, I realize that we're this thing we call citizenship is great. We're on an ocean of experience that is taking us forward, and you know, sometimes something may go wrong in the engine room, but we get down there and fix it, or whatever. But it's wonderful to be aboard in this lifetime and to experience the storms and the calms and the beauty of this incredible planet we live on, and that portion of it which we call Toronto.
Thanks, Duke. Anyone else?
Can I ask? Oh, I was going to ask Duke
Yeah,
something.
go ahead, Leslie.
Yeah,
And
I
then
was going. You know, I love that analogy, Duke, and I think the thing that went through my mind is, you know, in a number of the meetings with our diversity fellows, these are, you know, they come from all different sectors, and in conversations with that community, many of them are not feeling that they're on the ship. They feel like they're on, I don't know, the lifeboat on the side of the ship, or you know, waving some flares up to say, I'd like to get on that ship, and I don't feel like I'm in it. And I think that's a perception, because I think what you've described is I think where everybody wants to be. Everybody wants to be included. They want to feel they're together. And I am, but I do know for sure that there are a lot of parts of this city, this region, that is still trying to even figure out how to get on that ship.
yeah, good thought, Leslie. I remember when someone raised it with me, and we had a discussion about it, and that person said the way to understand the process of people coming new to a place, the immigrant experience, as it were, that there's the first thought is assimilation, and the second thought is integration, and the third thought is inclusion. And that it's kind of like coming to a new place, and someone said there's a dance going on, and that's assimilation. And someone says being invited to the party is integration, but being asked to dance is inclusion. And I never forgot that little simple way of describing it, because I think in many ways there were lots of hurts along the way, not just blessings, but most often many hurts as we move from assimilation to inclusion. And I thought, I think that's what you were saying. And I wonder if anybody else want to pick that up. But go ahead, John, and then, oh, sorry, Ron, and then John.
Just to tie in this issue of inclusiveness and issues more generally, how we reconcile, somebody in chat, how we reconcile the various communities that we belong to. I noticed in Leslie's comments, the place where you began, Leslie, was kind of rule of law, and you know, the first set of hurdles that one has to get through. And it reminded me about a book that I read a long time ago, but it was written in the 60s, and it was called American Kinship by an anthropologist named David Schneider. And in it, he was trying to understand how a society reaches a consensus of understanding of what's rational behavior. And one of the things he argued is that you get rational behavior through law, through the laws that we enact. And if we think about all the inequity and all the issues that we have, our go-to place, a lot of us as liberals, is to think about education, collaboration. How are the ways that we can be more inclusive? But you know, over my life, I've often wondered the role that creating and crafting law to force people to understand that's rational behavior. Is it, you know, is there a role for that? We react against that, but maybe that's a good thing. So just a thought.
That's pretty interesting, Ron, because the whole notion, the root notion of the common law is abstracting from day-to-day activity the rules and regulations that guide behavior. But it's the activity that comes first and the laws that come second. At any rate, please go ahead, John.
One of the things that that occurs to me is that, you know, the city, you know, like many cities, goes through these sort of spasms of growth, and like we're right in the middle of one of those. There was one sort of from the 1890s to the 1920s, the city's population grew fivefold. There was a moment in, you know, 1848 or 1847 when more people arrived from Ireland as refugees, twice as many as were in the city of Toronto at the time.
Right.
And, you know, so, and then between these periods of incredible growth, there are sort of plateaus. So we're in that period of incredible growth, and it's often really uncomfortable. You know, there's always housing problems and poor housing, and that creates social polarization. It excludes people. There's also a lot of economic opportunity. So, you know, there are newcomers who hustle and kind of make money. And so all of those frictions are really present, I think, in the, you know, in the Greater Toronto today. And so, you know, so some of what Leslie is talking about is, to my mind, you know, an expression of this, you know, this incredible dynamism that's, you know, we're like in this very fast moving train, and it's not clear how to control it sometimes.
David, can I go back to what Ron was talking about because and it links to what John is talking about, this notion of law and the structure upon which we build our societies. And yes, you know, we moved and we talk about the importance of collaboration. But when I talked about, you know, the rule of law, common experience, and collaboration, they build on each other. So if in fact the structure of the laws and rules we set are only able to or only imagined to address a subset of what we will become or are becoming, it then you have calls for, as you know, as folks at Black Lives Matter or other organizations saying, we need to disassemble some of those structures and rules in order to be more relevant to the society that we want to be and that we could improve. And so I think it's a really, it plays as important a role to what you were raising, Ron, as it does to our ability to work together and have a common purpose or vision.
Yeah,
Are you saying, Leslie? Go ahead, Ron. Go ahead, Ron, please.
No, I agree. The need to change those rules that we live by is as important as how we collaborate.
Yeah.
So we actually, there's value. Are you saying, Leslie, value in deconstructing some of the old myths?
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
In order to capture a new ground of myths?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. That's really interesting to me, because one of the things that struck me when I paid attention to the idea of community was that the form of technology for communication at the time must have played, I don't want to sound like a McLuhan on the cheap here, but on the other hand, it needs to be said that each generation trying to deal with it in any century is dealing with its own level of communication technology. And it struck me that I could try and find some way in which to explain that the technology of the wampum belt and the internet and print media are somehow got some connection one with the other that allows it to have a force. And I didn't know if I'm way beyond my own competency here, which I am, but I thought I'd put it to you because you're not. Anybody want to grab that stick?
Well, certainly, when we look at the evolution of communication as it is now being practiced by young people, I love the fact that the emojis that they use are very reminiscent of the pictographs that we used before contact. And there's a great deal of information in those pictographs, and the symbols that we used, and the information wasn't, to quote McLuhan, it wasn't linear. It was inclusive, was comprehensive. And the young people today are using their technology in a non-linear way, and they're using a language of communication that is being driven by technology, and it's come full circle back to the original way that human beings communicated with one another before the invention of writing, which was only about 6,000 years ago. I think the Sumerians in the Middle East developed it. But before that, when we think about what motivates us every morning to get up in the morning, there's a combination of one or of four motivations, and that's all there is. And that's money, power, self-preservation, and the arts, or romance, family, and engaging our world that way. So when we think of it like that, traditionally the Indigenous people, because we had no institutions of power, such as armies or police forces or factories or political parties or parliaments or churches so we didn't have access to that. Our motivation to get up in the morning before contact was self-preservation and romance in the most beautiful forms of art and poetry and music and dance and family, and engaging with Mother Earth on a continual basis. Well, the settlers that came brought along two other motivations which we weren't familiar with, and that was money and power. And over the 500 years, it's only been recently that the dominant culture has shared money and power, beginning to share with Indigenous people. But over the 500 years of contact with settlers, we shared our knowledge of self-preservation, and we shared our arts in every way. And they've come down and they've impacted the world we live in and the city that we live in such a beautiful way. And I'm so pleased that in my lifetime I've actually seen the opening up of opportunities where we get to share some of the authority and money and power, along with our art and our capacity for resilience and self-preservation.
Duke, you must have, in your own life period, you've actually witnessed the coming of understanding and desire to understand and a desire to include Indigenous history and Indigenous culture in a way that was not even possible to think about when you were 20 years old.
It's true, David. I was always fascinated by the fact that characteristics that were attributed to the Indigenous people were borrowed by Madison Avenue and were used by industries. For instance, Mutual of Omaha with the Indian chief and the headdress. And I once asked one of the executives from Mutual of Omaha. I said, how did your company ever choose a chief in a headdress upon it? He said, well, Native people were admired for their honesty and their and if they gave their word, that was an insurance. And we built our company around that idea. And the same thing happened when I talked to the automotive industry, where people just love their Pontiac cars with that beautiful symbol of Pontiac on the front of the car, or today the Jeep Cherokee. And why the Cherokee? Because the Cherokee is known for its dependability, its strength, and its ability to get you in and out of the woods. So there was a time, what I'm getting at is that when Jim Thorpe was considered to be the athlete of the half century, when Tom Longboat was winning all the long distance races in the world, when the Americans put an Indian head on their nickel coin, when Roy Rogers, a native Cherokee Indian who was the king of the cowboys. So there was a time when Will Rogers was the voice of America, and we had the Tecumseh engine was considered to be the finest small engine in the world. That was there, but then things changed, and they changed after the Second World War, to tell you the truth, and the residential schools and so now I've watched that because I was born in 1939, just before the war started, and during all those years, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, there's been a steady growth, not only of our population, but of our acceptance and influence and invitation into Confederation, and in many ways that was absent. So yes, I've seen a lot, and I must say I'm more optimistic today than I've ever been in the past.
Thanks, Duke. Let me just move then a little further to not so happy circumstances, because we've, in a sense, right up until during this program, we've properly so, I think, lauded the way in which we tried to adjust, tried to work to widen the circle, all of that kind of stuff. But it was not without enormous hurt for lots of people, and racism and bigotry played a major role in the development of Toronto, as we know. And I just wondered if anybody had any thoughts about how we've been dealing with that and how we ought to perhaps do more of that. Any thoughts on it at all?
Maybe I can start, and others can join in. And I think for me, just very recently at CivicAction, we did a piece of just secondary research, nothing primary, brought together information and data on the status of Black Canadians relative to racism. And, you know, I pride, and I talk when I travel and talk around the world about this country and this place as the model place to live, how people are able to work together. When I saw that report, it really, it hit me hard, because what I saw was data that shows systemically for a Black Canadian, from the day they're born to the day they die, they are facing, and there's so much pain. But for whatever reason, and however it came to be as a society, and still to this day, because when I wrote about this in the Globe and Mail, and the comments were, you know, very distressing. But there is a denial that that this can be, in some places, there's a denial that racism exists, and it, you know, similarly on another dimension, more recently with what happened in Atlanta, the rise of anti-Asian hate, which also the data is showing we have per capita, the increase has been more significant in Canada than in the US. And I don't know that we have recognized or reconciled or opened ourselves up to this information. And so I think that is our weakness right now. And I think there is so much we need to learn about ourselves, being the large ourselves, and because there is a lot of healing that has to happen.
And learning more about ourselves, Leslie, by digging into our history and in a sense,
Yeah, yeah,
rediscovering our own history, huh?
yeah, history, and yeah, because it does go way back, and we've sort of compartmentalized. When I say we, I mean I just think, you know, even there's debate now at Stats Canada about how they collect data, and that data is sort of masking in its aggregation some of the issues. So I just feel that it's something that you know, I think hopefully this is our point of reckoning, and that we can recognize that this is something we really need to work on together.
Yeah, thank you. John? John
So,
and then Duke?
so I think that the history has to be understood, because, you know, what Leslie is describing is not new. So we had the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923 that discriminated against Chinese Canadians. We had, you know, the city of Toronto passed bylaws that prevented white women from working in Chinese businesses. The federal government had laws prohibiting Indigenous people from being in cities and gathering until, Duke, was it 1951? It's in the early 50s, not that long ago. And on, the Sunday, you know, the Sunday Blue laws. So just picking up on, you know, something we've discussed earlier, so I think it's important to acknowledge that these things happen and continue to happen. And, you know, I would say that a measure of any city's strength is its ability to talk to itself and to find ways of communicating and developing a language to overcome these problems. And sometimes that's a legal language, like to Ron's point, and sometimes it's political language. And not all cities are good at that. Some cities can't talk to themselves in a constructive way. And I don't know whether we have that. I'm not in a position to say. I think we do, but there are certainly times when I think we don't.
Duke, you wanted to say something? Thank you, Ron. John? No, Duke?
Yeah, one of the things that I find really bothersome is the continued description of a fiction that exists, and that fiction is that there is such a thing as races. As science is very clear on this, that there is only one race. It's the human race, and simply because you are on a spectrum as a human race in a shade of color, I just feel we didn't have races in the Americas before the arrival of the settlers. And it was bad science, it was fiction science that categorized human beings into separate categories of race. It's just, I hope that as the younger generation comes along, that they drop this idea that there's a black race, a red race, a yellow race, and a white race. No, there is one planet, and there's one human race, and we all belong here, and we have to learn to get along and to understand that the happiness of everyone on this planet is essential to our personal happiness. And in that way, we move toward thinking in terms of loving the planet and loving the creatures and the life that's on it, and not separate ourselves into these categories of subordination of one color being more important than another, because it's bad science, it's a fiction, and I'm hoping that we stop using those terms to describe ourselves as the human beings that we are.
Thank you. Ron, earlier you talked about the importance of law as a way in which we funnel our discussion in a rational way. And I think anyone who spends any time with good judge decisions and writings by judges and good legal writing understand there's a terrific value to the way in which we write laws that allow for us to be able to parse and parse the way in which we see reality. One of the things that did strike me, though, is that we've been searching for a very long time, not only within the law, but for what's the word we use to describe how we've developed and who we think we are today. So I remember years ago when we were desperately trying to figure out how we deal with this burgeoning number of cultures and languages, the word mosaic was probably used. Well, it was. And then some smart alecky professor talked about the vertical mosaic. But at any rate, it was an attempt to try and describe what Joe Clark used to call the community of communities. So my question to all of you might be, certainly do, Ron, if you can, does multicultural carry us very far anymore? Is there some other more collective term that we can use? Or I think we use diversity a lot now. Or is that just an academic's pursuit and not really important to what we should be doing in terms of how we figure out the inclusion aspect of our life? But it seems to me that if you don't have a word for it, it's more of a complicated tray you're looking at.
So I'll go first, and because that's a big question. Let me share something I know from the deep past and go back to that Huron community I was talking about earlier, which was, they were connected to other communities around North America. And people came into that community to visit, to spend seasons, or married in. And they came, they spoke different languages. Algonquins, like Anishinaabe people, went and lived with Iroquoian speaking peoples. And the diversity we think of today was a diversity that lived then in a very real way. But one of the things that we're taught is that people were adopted into the community and they became Huron-Wendat. So I would turn the question around and say, well, all these people who come to Toronto and we talk about diversity, when do we get to the point where we call everybody Torontonians?
Okay, good. Thank you. Anyone else want to pick it up? Go ahead, Duke.
Yeah, I think that if we use the definition of culture, culture is anything that you invent, borrow, or discover that satisfies your needs. Then you are borrowing from the world now. And Toronto is when we speak of diversity, I listen to the same music that the community of Toronto listens to. The same hospital I go to in Toronto would be the same one that I would find in Taiwan or in Japan. The cultures that we borrow and we combine them with those things which we invent that satisfies our needs. That's what makes us special. It's a world culture now. It's a planet culture in so many aspects, but there are certain traditions that we carry over for generations that give us a particular identity. And so we can share in everyone's culture, but we keep the traditions that are valuable to us and that we pass on from generation to generation. So that separation between tradition and culture it's getting blurred as time goes on with technology and so on, but it's an important part of understanding who we are as individuals living on this planet of ours.
Can I just to Ron's point about the question about when is it that we will, as you said, Ron, when can we all call ourselves or be Torontonians? And well, I don't think we're there yet because obviously this notion of shared experience as a community, it's not, I think at some point in time it was far more coherent possibly, but it's definitely just even from how people experience the city now, there's quite a difference in the way someone at Weston experiences it versus somebody sitting on the boardwalk in the beaches. And so I think I like David, I like the concept of the mosaic rather than some of the other ideas, because to me it is there's a picture that we're all working towards, but when we're in it we can't really see it, but we are allowed to retain the integrity of our, whether I'm a round shape or a diamond shape or if I'm dark color, light color, sparkly, or whatever it is, because I think it starts to speak to an aspiration of something that I think is more fulfilling and allows more people to flourish. The thing I wanted to raise was this you asked, is there a word, are we going to find the word that so that we talk to? And I'm not sure that we need the word insofar as there's so much intersectionality between what everybody is in this day and age. And so whether you're LGBTQ two spirited, or you're with a disability, or you're a woman, or you're like, there are people that have all these things in one and they're part of the human race. And so I think it may be the wrong thing to try to find that one word. Maybe Duke's definition of the broad human race and everything in its glory is what is sufficient. And if we can accept that, then we can actually create a more equal place.
Well, not having the word might actually be a more open gate to the freedom to explore.
Yeah. But our minds want us to name things. It's like we need to categorize it, and
absolutely right. So, okay. I was going to ask another question before we go to our audience for questions. And I remind the audience, by the way, that I should have mentioned it before. Just a reminder, if you have any questions to our panel, we'll be shortly looking at that. Go to the chat box at the bottom of your screen. John, did your arm go up? Or?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one very quick point that I think of what Toronto is as a verb, right? It's becoming, and it never actually gets to the place, right? Like this is what cities are.
Very good.
And that it's recombinant, which is not a great word, but it's the way I think about it, because, I think about, where my kids went to school. They went to school with people from everywhere, kids from everywhere, and they all learn from each other. And I don't want to use the melting pot idea because I don't think that's really a great analogy. They learn from each other, they create new things, and that's the vibrancy of the city. But you can only get that if you have a city which is porous and allows for communities to intersect. And that's something about planning. It's about social polarization and kind of pushing back against things that separate people.
Okay, good for you guys. That was really good.
Oh,
please go ahead. No, go
I was
ahead,
going to add one tiny piece.
Take your time.
Really, to John's point, and it's something that we're learning in some of the work we do at CivicAction. We started this initiative, which was really just connection, and because it is the nudge, the connection, which is about building a relationship that you would never expect. And so, rising leaders being connected to someone who's a C-suite CEO of some big whatever company. because it doesn't happen all the time. And those are the relationships that we need, all these different relationships that we need to try and nourish and encourage, because they're what create empathy and understanding and opportunity for all of us. To, in the same way John talks about, his kids are all together and they create this energy and innovation that is good for us, good for all of us.
Right, right. Good thought. I think it is probably close to the time that we should open the door for questions from our audience. I think have somewhere in the order of 10 questions. Mariah, are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, thank you. I can't tell you how pleased I am to hear that. So if you would curate a few questions for us, that would be delightful.
Of course. The first question, which I think has been touched on a little bit already, but just in case anyone wanted to speak on it further, how do we reconcile the conflicting interests of all the different types of communities, race, gender, ethnic groups, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, etc.?
What's the question? How do we
reconcile the conflicting interests of all the different types of communities?
Anybody want to take a shot at that?
I don't have the answer, but there's two ways you can approach it. One is you try to seek solutions that solve for many by number, or you seek solutions that address the most vulnerable. And the outcomes are very, very different. Because I'm a believer that if you address those of the most vulnerable, you actually you're able to address much more challenging, difficult issues. It just may not benefit a larger quantum of money, of people, not money, of people at that point. So I don't have the answer. This is a work in progress.
Yeah, I don't have a better thought myself than that, because it's the reconciliation is the day-to-day event. It's a day-to-day event. It's an annual event. It's a generational event. I mean, it depends on what kinds of issues you're talking about. I guess the one thing that's always struck me, if we've had any really good success, is that we have tried to move to a world of widening the circle to widen the discussion. And whatever people felt in their hearts, they learned quickly that they had to take care in how they expressed what they thought in order to attend to the needs of other people. And that was probably made more obvious by those who didn't bother paying attention to that and thought they were telling a home truth by simply being ugly and unmannerly.
You see, we had a tradition of settling disputes amongst each other by simply, in our communities, we acquired status by how much we could give, not by how much we could acquire. And if we could shift that kind of thinking in a modern world, then we would all be seeking reconciliation with each other and trying to outdo each other with in the pursuit of status by how much we could give in the pursuit of getting along. So that's that shift may come along someday, but I think it's a good start.
Well, it's a really good point, Duke. And many of the treaties, of course, were signed by a good time being had in the gift giving.
Yes, indeed. Yep.
Yep.
No question.
Okay, let's have a second question then. Mariah?
What role is education to play in enhancing our sense of community?
Anyone want to pick that up? What role is education?
It's everything.
It's everything. But
Yes.
Duke, you, I know that you actually teach, and most people would be surprised, I think. You used to teach kindergarten kids.
Well, I certainly I'm with the Toronto District School Board, and we work at developing curriculums that embrace all of the the new technologies that are coming along. And the thing that we emphasize nowadays with our children is we're no longer setting our children up to be good, factory workers or workers in an industrial revolution type of idea, but in a new technological revolution, which requires imagination, invention, creativity, and innovation. And so we're by introducing those kinds of ideas to our young people, they are doing unbelievable progress in bringing those aspects of the human personality to bear in opening up the sort of cloud of ignorance that we've lived with all through the 20th century. This 21st century has the capacity to be the greatest century in the history of humankind. And it also has the possibility, if we go down the other road, to be one of the most difficult times and challenges. So it's up to how we educate our children, and it's, in my view, it's everything.
Well, so when you're asked about it, the role of education, you say everything. There's I'm sure no doubt in anybody's minds that we have depended on it now for a very long time to be the great equalizer, to be the way in which at least some semblance of equity is struck in the city and in the country. So yeah, anyone else? John?
Just on this point, so in the city of Toronto, approximately 85% of children go to public school, which is great. In large American cities, the public school system is predominantly used by lower income people. So it is a great equalizer. And my concern about this particular issue is that because of the way the real estate market in the city is working, because of the price of housing and all of that stuff, that there is actually a kind of a two-tier system within this public system, which creates what are de facto private schools that are situated in the middle of very wealthy neighborhoods, including neighborhoods that didn't used to be working class neighborhoods. And so that the ability to see the education system as that thing that cross-pollinates, that allows for all of that kind of mixing and fission is potentially undermined, I think, by the way our housing system is working.
Can I just add
Really
to
good
that?
point. Ron and then Leslie.
So near the beginning, when I raised David Schneider in his American Kinship, and he was drawing the comparison between education as a tool to change behavior and law to change behavior. So it's an exceptionally important tool, but I have to say, I really worry about education today because of the world we live in. As I was listening to Duke, I was thinking, that's the world I want, where we teach kindness.
We all want to move to Duke's world.
I want to move to that world. But we live in a world where someone who writes a blog is the equivalent, to someone who actually knows what they're talking about. And it's increasingly difficult for people to tease the difference, to really know the difference. And they see some things and believe it. That may be more of a problem south of us, I don't know. But, I really worry about this issue of education because of what creeps into it. And I'm not necessarily saying in the school system, I'm saying outside of the school system,
Okay.
where people learn a lot. So I worry about this.
Okay.
That's why I think, systematic expressions of what we want to accept as appropriate behavior is important.
Right. Leslie, please.
So a couple things, and sort of to John's point about this two-tier system that is emerging, or even three-tier system that's emerging. I agree that this is a problem, and what it starts to delaminate the idea that the public school system could be the common experience, which creates community because everybody's having and experiencing it the same way. But that's not what's happening now. And so my second point was that, for me, to the question of how important is education, I think education, as Duke describes it, is, yes, education is something to consume, less so. And I think the thing about the education system, it needs to be able to engender a lifelong curiosity, because that's what's going to lead to better judgment. And I think that's what I worry about the system. And we see this because we work with employers around removing barriers to entry in, and this idea of education being about credentialism as opposed to life experience, lived experience, and the ability to be a critical thinker and all this kind of stuff. We somehow they've been separated from where they were when we talked about education, and I think that is also a big challenge for us, that the system itself and what it allows those who come out of it to how they continue to be curious citizens. I think we're falling a little short.
One of the things that we are beginning to really understand is that the education, the information platform that is the one that is free to everyone is the earth itself. And the earth is an information platform that has the capacity to keep us curious all our lives. And now that that the idea of experiential relationship to the planet, to the earth itself, we're taking the children out of those buildings, out of those concrete classrooms, and we're finding ways to have that experiential relationship to nature, and we can do it by having the children with their devices, going along in having an experiential relationship on a daily basis with nature, and nature and those places are free in a sense. We don't have to build more schools when we have the second largest land mass on earth, with 40 million people and 3 million freshwater lakes. We have the capacity in this country. We have everything that we need, and it doesn't have to be a two-tiered system for the rich and the poor, because what the Creator delivered to us was a wonderful planet filled with all the information necessary to make this journey through life in a very good way. And I think that we can move in that direction. The forest schools since the pandemic have just popped up all over the place, and often it's people with greater ability to have their children in a forest school situation. But that's not to say that we couldn't expand on that idea in our education system, and every child can have an iPad, and every child can go into the woods, and even in their own backyard, there's enough information in that backyard or golf course or park or anything to keep us busy for a lifetime. So I just throw that out there as.
Oh no, Duke, that was great. The connection between nature and technology was pretty impressive. In fact, there's a person on the chat box who just sent a note saying that they're going to start a movement that you should be the next chancellor of the University of Toronto.
Oh, my goodness.
So there you go. Just thought I'd pass it on. Okay. We'll take the next question if we could. That was really good.
So this question is framed around the first Parliament site and the potential development of Metro links. But what is the difference between community and a transit community, and how does transit affect community?
Well, I could ask anyone, but I think it might be coming straight at you, Leslie.
I'm happy to answer that one. Transit is a technology, it's not a community. It's a mechanism for some other end. It always has been, and we should always remember that. It's a means. It can't define a community. It can impact it by its structure spatially. But I think just bringing a piece of steel and rails to a place does not a community make. And so I think it's important for everyone, those that are building the transit, those that are going to be affected by it, those are going to use it. Remember that, because I think we tend to get caught up on the piece of thing that we're so enamored with, and forget who it's for. And so I think there's a big difference.
Well done. Anyone else on that one? Okay, Ron?
I just want to say that I fully endorse what Leslie just said, but also that transit can impact negatively community terribly. And when it comes to First Parliament, that's what we're witnessing.
Okay. Thank you. I'll leave that issue alone for another time. But that was really good. We have the next question, Mariah.
In the last century, Toronto had an annual event called Caravan, where people were invited into diverse community centers to learn about one another's traditions through sharing cultures. Do you think it is time for such an event to be revived in order to help foster a sense of Toronto community?
Not a bad idea. If I could take a first shot at it, I was there in 1968 when Metro Caravan was started. And it was a great success for 20 years. And it probably would have gone on longer. I was once asked why the old Caravan didn't continue. And the answer really was that Toronto actually became Caravan. I mean, Caravan in those days was a 10-day holiday. All the kids from school got free tickets. And you visited various cultures to celebrate the cuisine and song and dance. But that was a terrific way in which to find out about people who could easily have been simply the other. And so people, and by the way, I thought I saw the word Lamberti, and Mrs. Lamberti was part of the Folk Art Council. It's probably one of her, I don't know, relatives at any rate, but those people are unsung. Leon and Zina Kosser organized it. They were both Ukrainian Canadians from Saskatchewan, but Metro Caravan introduced Torontonians to Torontonians from different colors and languages and so on. So do we need a new one? Maybe. I haven't given it much thought, but it probably should use the new prevailing technology as well. At any rate, other people may have some more thoughts.
Well, certainly,
John.
I think Caravan grew out of that.
Caravan was around the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. John?
I was just going to say I used to get those passports at the end of the school year. I remember those.
That's absolutely.
Yeah. My one thing about Caravan, and I mean, everything you say, David, is true, but you don't want to get into a situation where you're kind of, it's sort of like a Potemkin village, like sort of a costume version of a culture. And I think always the risk of these things is that you don't necessarily see the internal dynamics in like a culture. And
absolutely. No, the point is really well taken, and that's a better answer to the second part. Should there be a new one, I would do so with care, because the question in the 50s and 60s was, how do you get people together, at least so they see one another? And of course, the easiest way to do is to eat and drink and song. And that's what it was about. But we should not pretend that that's the whole of life.
Yeah, maybe I can just add, because I think I have mixed feelings. I remember Caravan when I first came to Toronto, and for me, I think I would worry about what I call the Disneyfication of culture, which creates certain impressions or stereotypes. I mean, it was fun, a lot of fun. Food was great, all that kind of stuff. But I'd love to see a Caravan that went a little deeper, that actually enabled me to understand more about it beyond, and is what was more, I guess, immersive than sort of not only entertaining.
Yeah, fair enough. I agree with that.
I
We
think
did produce more Ukrainian dancers than Ukraine. I can say so.
Expo Toronto would be fantastic, where we're not so much celebrating the past, but the future that all these communities in Toronto are bringing together. And Expo Toronto should maybe on our radar somewheres.
Okay, good. Let me go to another question. We've got.
David, one more. Sorry, I just
No, please go ahead, Leslie.
Duke made me
No.
think of this, and I just so here's one thing that I wish I saw the city and the region do more of, which is, to your point about imagining the future that is not a future drawn by architects with towers in renderings, that we had a culture that was more constantly thinking about what we could be, and being part of the discourse, spatially, socially, economic. We're always down on ourselves about what we're not doing right, and we don't stretch the muscle of imagination enough in this city. I mean, there are people doing it, but we need to do it more, because that's the kind of thing that an expo tries to do, right? It's like, it could be different. It doesn't have to be like this. It could be a different thing. And anyway, I just wanted to get that in.
Good point. Good point. Ron, go ahead.
Just one quick point. As I was listening about Caravan, we had our own experiences with that. And of course, I think we all loved the food experience, learning the different foods in the city. But I was thinking more seriously about this, and where are we headed as a city is where we came from. I think we want the city to be a dish with one spoon. Is that not what we want?
Yes.
Duke?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time, I think, for one or two questions.
I'll just echo first a number of comments in the chat, thanking you all for the fascinating discussion. So I had to let you know. But the last question in the chat is, Mayor Lamport said Toronto is the city of the future and will always be. Is this still true? Is this our secret?
Yeah, I think I was around when Lampy actually said that, and it was considered to be a joke at the time, because he was talking about a place that could never be. Right? I mean, at any rate, Lampy was not a subtle person, but there we go. What do you make of Lampy's stuff now? He was also very famous for saying, if somebody's going to push me off the bridge, I want to be there.
I just want to say I'm happy to be on a panel where somebody refers to him as Lampy.
Thank you very much. At any rate, there is something to what he was saying. He saw it as a kind of evolving future. And he was very much to what Leslie and you others were saying. We need imagination. And Lampy simply saw the city as never ending. It was always going to evolve. And maybe that's fair enough. We didn't get that at the time, but on the other hand, that's I think the best light you can put on it. Anybody want to pick it up? We're evolving.
Yeah, we don't have a choice about the city becoming staying here into the future, unless we as citizens do something really outrageous, which is bring the whole business down by not being conscious of the sustainability and our commitment to keeping this planet as a beautiful place to live.
Right. Anyone else now? I've got, what am I, I've got, well, is there any more questions at all? Mariah?
That was our last question.
Okay, I have one last, oh, sorry, Leslie, please go
No,
ahead.
no, I was gonna say I think the thing that's so weird about that, when you gave the context, the question came out very, very differently. So in the sense that he was, in terms of the intention of what he was saying. But what I was thinking, as Duke says, and I think John said it earlier, we're always in a state of being and evolving. And the question is, do we want to be deliberate about it or not? Because we'll all continue to do whatever we're doing. Do we want to, in some way or shape or form, shape that future? And I think, do we want to hands off or just let it happen? And I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves. It's not so much, do we want, to be a city of the future? We will be a future. It's just, which future do you want?
Do you think this, sorry, John, go ahead.
I
John?
was just going to say that, so my wife's family is from Buffalo. They live in Buffalo and Rochester. And so I've been going back and forth for 35 years. And those cities don't change. And I think about, being taken to the St. Lawrence Center when I was a kid. And, David, as you know, everything around there was a parking lot, right?
That's right,
And
absolutely.
so now it's not a parking lot. It was shaped. It wasn't always shaped exactly the way the planners wanted it. And but I think that two places are quite, they're contrasts, because cities don't necessarily move into the future. Sometimes they just stay the same. And we haven't stayed the same.
No, we have not. And I was going to ask, there are various periods in Toronto's history that one can choose to where there is more energy and sometimes less. I wonder where you think we are today is a final question, mainly on the question of community, if you can. But generally speaking, in terms of what we were just talking about, our ability to say we're evolving, we'd like to do it in some deliberative way rather than just sort of grow up like Mopsy. And I wondered if you thought we were in a good position, or are we on a scale of 10? Are we a 6 or 8 or a 4? Duke, I'll start with you, Duke, because you son of a gun, you always look on the bright side of things.
He does.
So good.
Well, it can only be bright, like I said before. This is the century of Canada, no question. We are going to have people from all over the world. Already they are itching to get here, and we have to prepare a nest for them where they're welcome, and and build the country of the future. There's we have so many resources, and I loved what Ron said about the a dish with one spoon. And the dish with one spoon is, there's one dish, it's called Canada. One spoon are the people who live here and thrive here. And so that's on a scale of 1 to 10 on that basis, we're moving pretty close out of 9 toward 10.
Thanks, Duke. Ron.
Yeah, I obviously embrace that view of where we're heading, the one of dish with one spoon. But I think it takes leadership. And I worry about leadership a lot. I don't want to draft David Crombie for mayor again, but we need thoughtful, forward-thinking leadership. And it's, believe me, I'm much happier than I was, let's say, 5 years ago, or 6 years, or 8 years ago. But it really is going to take a lot of leadership to recognize the challenges, many of the challenges that Leslie raises. And I really like the notion of education relating back to nature, because that gets us back to providing a grounding for everybody in the city, in the land. And if we can get there through educating people about our ravine systems, our natural systems, and to embrace the fight against the things that threaten that understanding. And that's where we need leadership to stand up for these values. And sometimes I've been disappointed in the last 10 years in how often that leadership has not been there. So I think we all need to think about, if we embrace these values and we want that kind of world, what can we do to do that? And I think one of the ways is through whom we elect.
Thanks, Ron. John, and then Leslie.
So I think that the thing that makes me optimistic is also the thing that is, a little bit distressing, which is that, in the last several years, I think that we have had a more honest conversation about what the city is and what the city's good at and what the city's not good at. And so, to Leslie's point about the report that she cited at the very beginning of this event, there's more conversation about that, and there are more voices that are allowed to participate in that conversation. So I think that that's a healthy thing, even though it's not the best news. It's better to talk about it and to acknowledge it than to sort of resort to bromides and slogans.
Okay, good, thank you. Leslie, you can finish it off for us.
So two things. First of all, you asked the question in the history of this whole city, country, where would, I think right where I am sitting now is, to me, one of the most energizing and positive places to be. When I look around the world, and for two reasons. And one has to do with leadership, and Ron was concerned about the lack of leadership. There are leaders amongst us. I see them every day. They just need people to open the doors for them. They just need to be recognized as leaders, because we have what I call the stereotype of what a leader looks like. And leadership is now coming in so many different shapes and forms. And we need to know how to recognize it and see it, because sometimes it's standing right in front of us. And so I think that's one. And I know and the work we do and lots of other organizations, helping young leaders to find their place at the tables where decisions are making and opening the doors for them is an important thing. And I agree with John. I said, part of the maturity, even though this is a long-standing, this maturity is taking really long, the ability to be self-critical is the only way we can grow. And so we are now at a point to be able to be a bit more self-critical and not only patting ourselves on our shoulders saying, oh, we're a global city. Yeah, good for us. We're in good shape. We don't really, let's just stay the course. Being self-critical is the next step to evolving to a higher, better place. So I'm happy to be sitting in this very, very spot.
Thank you, Leslie. And Duke, you have the last word.
Oh, well, the last word, we have 40 million dreams out there. And when we bring those, the collective consciousness together with the leadership that is required, it will become a vision, a beautiful vision for the future. So that's what I see for the way forward.
Thank you very much, Duke. And thanks to you, all five of you. It was five of us, yes. Four of you. I'm thanking myself. That's a good start.
It's worthy, thanks.
Thanks to the four of you. And thanks to the audience for joining us tonight. We'll see you on May the 19th. And we're now cut off.
No, we're here still.
Are we still there? Okay, on May the 19th, in which the topic will be the future and the shape of things to come. Please join us then. Thanks again, folks. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Language.
Okay. Oh, we're left.